Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily update for April 23rd, 2021. It's Friday, so we have questions, but I want to begin with what's becoming an increasingly pressing issue, which is the inflation that's now very evident in the Western economies. Jerome Powell keeps talking about how we need a little inflation. We're watching carefully. We're going to keep an eye on it, but in the meantime, we're going to continue the flood of liquidity from the central bank, which is also going on with the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, in order to keep the system going, the liquidity that they think is needed. Now, they're doing a cover-up here. The reason they have to have liquidity is because the system as a whole is insolvent. And rather than have the insolvent instruments cashed in, which would trigger a domino-style collapse in virtually every area of financial instruments, they're playing a game, which is that we can keep the money going in, and until there's hyperinflation, then when it starts to take off, we can always tighten. Well, you know the old saying, there are none so blind as those who refuse to see. Open your eyes, Chairman Powell. Look at what's going on. I just have a few figures that show that inflation has already hit with a vengeance. First of all, let's start with something that people usually don't think about, used car prices. Well, used car prices have hit an all-time high. According to something called the Mannheim Index, which is an index of used vehicle prices, it shows a jump of 10% in the last month. And the market as a whole has gone up 41% since February 2020. That is, the prices have gone up 41% since February 2020. That's a pretty steep climb. Now, at the same time, construction materials have gone way up. Lumber, concrete, but just in terms of lumber, this is quite astonishing. The price of plywood. For a sheet of plywood, in March 2020, it was about $38 per sheet. By February 2021, it had gone up to $72 per sheet. By April, the price of a sheet of plywood is now $96, a 252% increase. That's not inflation, huh? Now, you also have what's happening with the stock market, which over the 6 to 8 month period had a 30% crash and then is now moving up into record highs. And then, of course, you've all seen the tremendous inflation in the so-called Bitcoin currency markets, which have gone way up. Some of them are starting to crash now. Now, what's driving this is trillions of dollars from the central bank, and Powell is saying that he's going to continue to purchase put out $150 billion a month. In the meantime, the Fed now owns $2 trillion of mortgages and nearly 20% of all treasuries. So this idea that you can keep an economy going by easy credit and then put on the brakes when inflation starts to hit, we're well past that. We've already gone over the cliff. And this is a time we need concerted effort, not at a fake Green New Deal or a Great Reset, but a bankruptcy reorganization. This calls to mind the importance of Lyndon LaRouche's triple curve, which is a classic collapse function, in which you see on the one side monetary and financial inflation, assets, appreciating in value exponentially, while the physical economy is on a downward curve. And it's worth noting on this that when the price of used cars are going up so much, the actual production of automobiles is collapsing. The figures here, auto production fell from 12 million units in December to 9 million units in March. That's per month. So we're seeing a significant drop in production. And as a result, the price of those cars which are available, including used cars, are going up. So I would urge people to look at the link at the bottom of the description where Lyndon LaRouche discusses his triple curve function, because this has been the measure or the means by which he's been able to be a successful forecaster. In fact, the most successful forecaster of economic trends over the last 40 years. Now, there are a couple of questions, one of which is just a little bit too complicated to answer on the short update, but about the coincidence of opposites. And isn't the Committee for the Coincidence of Opposites, or Committee on the Coincidence of Opposites, isn't this a driver for political mobilization? Well, it's more than that. It's actually a way of thinking about everything. How to break out of a box of axioms which leave you with bad choices to actually come to a higher resolution. And we had a recent conference where we had a whole panel on how that's working in terms of addressing the global food crisis, the COVID crisis, and this will be one of the subjects at the May 8th conference coming up. So be sure to go to the schillerinstitute.com and register for that conference, and you'll hear much, much more about this question of the Committee on the Coincidence of Opposites. Now, a second question was, how do you take this crisis of a danger of thermonuclear war and overcome it? In a sense, transform the tensions into an impulse for economic development. Well, the problem is you have an establishment, a political, military, economic establishment, which inhabits most of the offices of the U.S. Congress, which dominates the media, which doesn't allow a contrary view to be heard, which day after day is trying to brainwash you to think that Russia and China are the greatest threats to America. You know, whether it's rigging elections, whether it's paying to kill our soldiers in Afghanistan. Virtually every single one of these charges that's been made have proven to be unsupportable because there's no evidence. They are fabrications designed to create a political intent, namely to create enemy images of other nations, not just to justify huge defense budgets, but more importantly, to impose on the world divisions which prevent a unified action to address the real problems we face, such as real hunger, such as a global pandemic where we are not producing enough vaccines for the numbers of people who need them, which is basically the whole world. So how do you address these crises when you look at each one individually? And that's the only way to overcome any of these crises is by looking at the whole picture and realize that there are essentially two different approaches to the concept of man, of human civilization. One is the oligarchic approach, the approach defined by the British Empire, by Parson Malthus, which essentially says that all human beings are essentially driven by bestial impulses, the desire for food, shelter, sexual pleasure, and that this is what are the defining characteristics of human society. And if you believe that, then essentially you will accept the idea that we are all in a battle for individual gain, that we're in a war of each against all, as the British psychotic philosopher Hobbes said, where the law of the jungle reigns, and whichever is the strongest power can make the rules. What do you think a rules-based order is? As long as you have people in power who think that way, and not just the people in power, but even many, many good people who want to see this swamp drained, they want to see the establishment crushed. Nevertheless, in their deepest thoughts, they accept this as the nature of man, that human beings are essentially driven by greed, by self-interest, and that therefore each individual owes it to themselves to seek the most that they can get. And if you accept that as a worldview, then you're going to tolerate the Mike Pompeos and the Tony Blinkens, who essentially say that combat is the essence of human civilization, fight over shrinking resources. And under those circumstances, you'll fall for the crap that's being peddled at this Earth Day summit by Biden and most of the Western European nations, typified by the idiocy of listening to people like Greta Thunberg and the Mexican version of Greta Thunberg. So that's one aspect of that's one worldview. The alternate worldview is the worldview of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, the worldview of the American Constitution, which is that people are essentially good, but flawed. And government plays a role in limiting the power of those people driven only by personal interest, and instead levels the playing field so that everyone has an opportunity to participate as a creative being in the goods production needed for mankind to survive. And that isn't just physical goods, but it's ideas. And so if you take the latter point of view, which is the view of Lyndon and Helga LaRouche, which is the view of all great creative thinkers, from Plato through Leonardo da Vinci, Shakespeare, Mozart, and Beethoven, up to the present, that view is a view of a republican conception of man, that individuals can form together governments which will represent the common good, which will act for the general welfare, which is in our preamble to our Constitution, as opposed to a bunch of greedy little animals who are seeking a high ground from which to shield whatever they've been able to gather and protect it from everyone else. So if you start with that as the assumption of what is the nature of man, then it becomes obvious. The system's broken down. The people running it have grabbed all the loot they can, and they still don't have enough because of the debt they've created. That debt has to be canceled. Their debts have to be wiped out. We need a bankruptcy reorganization, and then we need to move to the physical production that was characterized by the development of this nation with a Hamiltonian credit policy, infrastructure investment, and science and technology. If we do that, we'll be fine. And then we can sit down with Russia, with China, with any other nation on the world and discuss with them how we can achieve this, how we can achieve peaceful cooperation. And the last question was someone who said, well, aren't Russia and China really threats to the United States? Well, no, they're not. They're threats to the unipolar world order, which is the outlook that has been imposed on the United States by the globalists, the free traders, the neoliberals, and the neoconservatives, who are trying to establish a unipolar order to keep everyone else down so that this bankrupt system can keep sending the rewards their direction. This includes the military-industrial complex, so-called, the swamp, and so on. Russia and China are not bankrupting the United States. American banks are bankrupting the United States. The policies of the Federal Reserve are putting us on a course toward total bankruptcy. As to the danger of war, it comes not from malign actions by China and Russia. In fact, China has invited us to join in the Belt and Road Initiative, which would benefit enormously American corporations. Not to mention the countries that need the infrastructure in Africa and South Asia and so on. So there are no inherent reasons why we should have Russia and China in our heads as enemy images. They didn't disrupt the elections. They didn't put bounties on soldiers, American soldiers in Afghanistan. They're not messing with our cyber capabilities. In fact, everything that they're accused of doing by Britain's GCHQ and the National Security Agency and the CIA, we're actually doing, as Edward Snowden and people like Bill Binney have exposed. So if we go back to the American system and take up the challenge of using our constitutional system to advance the creativity of every individual, and to inspire the imagination of every child, we have no problem and we'll have no enemies. At least not that we can't sit down and talk to and resolve whatever differences we do have. So that's my report for today. I would encourage you to look at the Schiller Institute website and the LaRouche organization website over the weekend to follow whatever developments occur, and I'll be back with you on Monday.